Okay, no,
that's the challenge. You can say all you want, you can put it in legislation that there's exceptions. When it comes into practice, that's where the challenge really lies. So Teiotsistohkwathe. I am from Kahnawake, the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake, and I am here to present our position on your proposed bill. We cannot overemphasize how integral hunting and harvesting is to our identity, and today I will present examples of how this bill will affect the ability to express that. There are potential repercussions on our rights to carry out a deeply rooted cultural practice, which is already restricted within the existing framework. I will also call in the lack of consultation with Indigenous communities and the effects of this deficiency in creating your bill. Harvesting is deeply woven into the Kahnawake culture and fabric of who we are. As Ungwehue, meaning original people, we have inherent practices that we have been engaging in since time immemorial. These practices are deeply ingrained in our ceremonies and stem from inherent roles and responsibilities that are integrated into who we are from a generational and family level from birth. 6 years ago, my son was named in a naming ceremony. His name was raised and words were spoken, letting him know that when the time comes, his uncles will teach him our ways and to take on our inherent roles and responsibilities and take him hunting on the land. He has potential to be a father, to provide for a family, and be supported by the other men in his family to fulfill this role. In our culture, we are taught to balance the roles and responsibilities as humans with those of the other living beings here on Mother Earth. All this inherent knowledge and understanding is what we carry day to day. This understanding of our roles, responsibilities, and the respect for the cycle of life is what makes us who we are as Ungwehue. This cycle and balance has been interrupted by colonization, which has also established an evolution of our practices, from bows and arrows to firearms, in order to fulfill our obligations in sustaining that balance. At the same time, the development of lands has had a cumulative impact on the hunting locations, which are now more isolated, affecting migration paths, which have decreased breeding areas and provides detrimental change to ecosystems. Losing culture through restrictions of our rights is not a theoretical. This loss has been lived in real time by me and my family, as well as my community and those of my sister communities of the Iroquois caucus. The restrictions on our rights under the current licensing structure are already unacceptable, and further restrictions could be fatal to our cultural practices. Urban sprawl and buildup around Kahnawake means we cannot hunt where we live, nor can we travel with our appropriate firearms to hunt in Jawarodu, a hunting territory located in the Laurentians that is shared with Kanesatake. We often must drive many hours and take time off work managing yearly harvests under severe time constraints. This bill and its amendments will further limit the potential for our families to harvest for sustenance during each crucial harvesting cycle. It will impact both our hunting methods and our success rate. When you start to interfere with that success, you interfere with food security and how that person can provide sustenance to their communities and families. In this context, and speaking from experience, I know that the possibility of firing successive shots can make the difference between downing an animal that will feed my family through the winter and injuring an animal that may at best take hours to track, or at worst result in an injured animal dying in the woods and wasted meat. We understand that some of the firearm prohibitions and suspensions include a sustenance exception, requiring that firearms remain available to individuals who demonstrate that they need a firearm to hunt. However, we would like to point out that those exceptions fall short in acknowledging and respecting the reality of the people from my community as well as those from the Iroquois caucus. The realities of Indigenous people who travel for sustenance harvesting with their firearms are being overlooked due to the lack of consultation. Your government needs to take the time to ensure that there is recognition and acknowledgements made to reflect our Indigenous rights and our realities. Systemic racism in policing is also an issue for many Indigenous communities. Exemptions are only accessible when other law enforcement are properly trained to understand our reality. Impacts of the provincial and federal failure to educate outside police forces are already felt by community members who face problems such as establishing and documenting their rights as sustenance harvesters and transporting firearms for hunting in other parts of Canada. There is no carve-out in Bill C-21 for the exercise of our inherent jurisdiction rights, nor was any consultation carried out to solicit our input. There is no recognition of the way existing prohibitions and licensing already limit and have adverse impacts on our rights, and no attempt made to help us determine which specifications or models need to be protected, ensuring that there is a balance between safety and sustenance. With this, the Iroquois Caucus requests a meeting with the committee. It is for the Ganyakahaga of Kahnawake, not for Canada, to decide what is fitting for our people. We have entrusted enforcement to the Kahnawake peacekeepers. I'd also like to point out that this bill will place an administrative burden on our peacekeepers who already face chronic underfunding, understaffing, and intransigence regarding our proposals for culturally appropriate firearm control. Concurrently, the lack of in-depth and comprehensive consultation with Indigenous communities is demonstrated in the incoherence and inconsistency of this bill, the proposed amendments therein, and the lack of acknowledgement on the rights of Indigenous peoples. The retracted amendments would have prohibited a broad spectrum of hunting rifles, shotguns, and other long guns used by our hunters. And evergreen definitions may not be any better. They would curtail our ability to access new developments in firearms, as other witnesses have already pointed out. Even a cursory review of the retracted amendments reveals important inconsistencies in the firearms selected for the inclusion. So you see, when you talk about firearms as objects, you forget that it's the person holding it that makes it either a tool for sustenance or a weapon. We ask that you address the real underlying problems that cause gun violence, not further restrict Indigenous peoples from carrying out their lives in a sustainable, ceremonial, and generational way. Find a way to support firearm safety training, find a way to support awareness against gun violence, and address the mental health issues that lead to gun violence. Help in demonstrating that when handling the power of a firearm comes great responsibility. Tony Wanege.
I think that's probably one of the best testimonies that's honest, real, and speaks to the issues that we have been talking about with this bill. So thank you for that plain look at how it impacts you and your community. I want to take you back to a comment you made early on in your introduction about basically your Indigenous exemptions under the Ordering Council that came in May of 2020. Now, we know that this government is particularly bad at legislation, and now I understand that, Liberals will sometimes say the right thing, but making it happen is a different issue when it comes to actually getting the job done. So, case in point, the Ordering Council of May of 2020 took away Indigenous firearms that were used for sustenance hunting, and then the Liberals paraded out this exemption that they talked about, an amnesty, if you will, respecting Indigenous rights under Section 35. Now, there's limitations of that, however, and you touched on it briefly. And I just want to, I won't read the whole thing, but one of the things that the excerpt talks about in the actual act talks about if specific firearm was on April 30th of 2020 non-restricted firearm, used it for hunting in the exercise of a right recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Act, of a Constitution Act of 1982, or sustenance hunting, the person or their family, they can use that firearm until they are able to obtain another firearm for that use, which is really, to me, it seems to be a cop-out. The Liberals are really, they give you a juicy talking point. There's no substance that it violates. To me, it potentially violates Section 35 with that little, one little short sentence in there, and it puts Indigenous hunters at risk for being criminalized if they're caught with a firearm when they could have possibly taken a prohibited firearm previously now and not bought a new one. What are your thoughts on that? How do you address that with your community, and have your Indigenous hunters from your community addressed that as a concern to you?
So it definitely is a concern, as I've brought it to it today. Anyway, I was only given 5 minutes to speak on it. However, when it comes to the criminalization of these weapons, like I've mentioned, it's really difficult to prove that we have the right to the weapons. The permitting, especially in Quebec, for my community is located in Quebec, the permitting is not consistent. It is non-functioning at this moment. I know that there are a few of them waiting for their pals, waiting for different permits in order to hold different weapons, and also the I guess, the essence of family hunting as well. So there's limits as well on the kind of gun that you can have, or the kinds of gun, or the numbers of weapons that you can have. So if families go hunting together, they cannot travel together because there are limits with that. And it affects the day-to-day, but the present practices that we have in hunting.
And I also, thank you for that. I also appreciated your explanation in regards to how the Act, as proposed in C-21, really doesn't impact public safety. It goes after the wrong issue. It impacts your community as Indigenous hunters. It impacts, sport shooters and hunters and farmers across the country. And one of the things that I have seen recently is the government in Quebec is spending, some money to deal with some of those issues that they find to be the real problem, which is smuggling from across the U.S., from the U.S. into Canada, and they're spending, over $6 million over a number of years to try and make that happen. And the Minister of Public Safety in Quebec talked about the money that will make that region safer. So I know that we've talked, a lot in this committee and in the House about, if we really wanted to impact public safety, we needed to close some of the porousness of our border and provide resources there at our border to impact the illegal smuggling of firearms into this country, and rather than spending resources going after law-abiding Canadian firearm owners, including Indigenous communities, who are not public safety risks. So how do you see what this Quebec initiative is doing, and any suggestions you may have from your nation and to the federal government on what we need to do to seal up our borders to stop the illegal smuggling of firearms in this country, which is a significant problem as identified by law enforcement across the country?
So in speaking with Minister Mendicino, I think it was 2 weeks ago, I had mentioned that the perspective of the federal government is on the weapon itself as being the killer. And I had made it clear to him that his position on that was different than ours, that we see the person behind the weapon itself. As for the border issue, I think that more resources and funding should go to investigative approaches to the smuggling ring, if you would call it that, and more education and more funding on the expertise and funding towards policing.
Mr. Motz had mentioned the order in council and that there was an amnesty for Indigenous peoples exercising their Section 35 hunting rights. I'm just wondering if there is something brought forward dealing with an assault weapon ban, would you support something similar that would exclude Indigenous peoples from that ban?
In terms of the assault rifle ban, I'm going to be extremely honest. I'm not completely privy to all the different types of weapons that there are listed. I'm not privy to are completely aware or completely understanding of the different types of weapons. However, I would not be able to answer questions like that based on the fact that we have not had the opportunity to consult across the Confederacy, across from the Iroquois caucus. So answers to that question is required with further consultation.
Okay, thank you. That's fair. Chief Lazare, I don't know if you had a chance to look at that provision or not, the red flag provision in the bill.
Okay, so I will answer as brief as possible. I do believe that there is a little bit of give and take in terms of that red flag provision. I know that there's pros and cons. However, when it comes to the systemic racism that we have in policing, there's a lot of issues that need to be fixed before we can consider things like that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I understand from your testimony today and from a press release that you published, and also a letter you sent to our chair and to the Minister of Public Safety, that you have opinions about the spirit of the bill. there are good and bad impacts. And from what I understand, there will be impacts on your community. So I guess I'm wondering if your position is about G4 and G46 that were withdrawn, or is it about the whole bill?
Essentially about the whole bill. I think it's important if, like I mentioned before, that the lack of consultation is one of our major concerns. So if given the opportunity, we would give you a comprehensive perspective of our lived realities. It would allow your government to balance your perspectives without having an adverse impact of Indigenous peoples being able to hunt and harvest. An opportunity should be required to allow us to deliberate on the common threads between our nations in order to give you a more in-depth description of any special exemption or any required amendments that we would like to have or like to see.
From what I understand, there's been a lack of consultation. You didn't meet Mr. Mendicino, didn't you?
And Mr. Mendicino, that was on February 22nd, 2023. That was, I think, about a week or two after we sent the letter.
OK. Est-ce que votre
And was your conversation beneficial? Did it provide any clarity, or did it calm any concerns you might have?
It was beneficial in a way that we got to meet face to face. He got to see where we were coming from as a council and not only discuss it with just one individual, but to speak with the whole of the council and to get a little bit of our experience. However, I do not deem that as adequate consultation.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
Si je reviens à la position sur
Now, I'd like to come back to your position on the bill. You were asked questions by my colleague, Ms. Damoff, and you said that perhaps there hasn't been enough information about the list in terms of what is allowable or not, what will be on the banned list, what is acceptable. So I'm just trying to understand, are you against... If you're against the bill, does that mean you're against parts of the bill? Or I'd like just to hear you expand on this somewhat. For example, what firearms exactly will your members use and you'd like to see exempted, for example, from any kind of prohibition? Generally speaking, how do you perceive this list? I understand that not everyone will be happy with this bill, but we're holding these extra meetings in order to try and find solutions, or in order to at least try and do better than the first time. So I'm just wondering if you have any recommendations. Of course, your main message seems to be that there has to be better consultation, especially amongst those who are going to be directly impacted by this bill. But besides that, do you have any specific recommendations to make?
I don't have any specific recommendations to make because we weren't provided an opportunity to be able to delegate or discuss between ourselves as nations to be able to answer that. The governance that we work and the framework that we work in is not necessarily a party kind of governance framework. It's a more consensus-based framework where we all have differing opinions, we all have differing perspectives and realities. And like I said, if given the opportunity, we would be able to have, or given the opportunity for the time, to be coming together and creating that list of exemptions so that we can find the common threads that we can suggest to amend in this bill. So I can't speak on behalf of one person. I am representing the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake, but I cannot speak on behalf of other communities, essentially other Indigenous communities. However, I've been given the go-ahead to speak on behalf of the Iroquois caucus, which feels the same way that I do in regard to the lack of consultation and the lack of timing that we have for consultation. It requires a lot of time and a lot of energy that I'm sure that governments usually don't have the... or that I've witnessed they don't have the patience for, or the understanding that there's a lot of different factors to consider in terms of that.
Et je vous remercie. Je terminerai peut-être en...
Thank you. Perhaps I can ask you about something else that caught my eye in your letter. You said
on the shoulders of the peacekeepers who safeguard our territory and will increase the potential for discriminatory and over-policing of our people off territory. Pourriez-vous...
Could you expand on that, please? Could you tell us about the extra work that might impose on your peacekeepers?
So as I've mentioned, we do have hunting territory that is in the Laurentians, about an hour away from our community. So the peacekeepers are our entrusted enforcement for the community of Kahnawake as well as Jawarodu. So we have to travel an hour away in order to get to that territory. However, within that hour, if you start criminalizing some of, like, enforcing the gun restrictions, that hour from Kahnawake to Jawarodu is an hour that someone is risking when they bring up their weapons to that hunting territory. An hour that they're risking. So we have our own jurisdiction in Kahnawake. That jurisdiction applies to Jawarodu, but there is, because of colonization, because of developments, that we are separated an hour away and that we are not connected to that territory, and we cannot hunt in our territory as well.
Forward. And I'd like to start with you, Chief Lazare, just to understand the issue of the lack of consultation that you flagged in your presentation. You said that you'd met with the minister on February 22nd. Prior to that, was the Mohawk Council, was the Iroquois caucus consulted in any way about this legislation? And if not, okay.
No, it's okay.
Yep. And if not, when was the last time there was any approach from the federal government on firearms legislation?
None that I'm aware of right now. I am new to the Iroquois caucus, so I am still getting briefed on the different files that they've taken on, but based on the previous discussions, they're not necessarily addressing Bill C-21 or haven't been addressed for Bill C-21 as of yet.
So prior to February 22nd, there just was no consultation. The federal government didn't come to you in any way, either the council or the caucus, to ask your views on the legislation?
No.
Okay. You have spoken very eloquently about the amendments and the NDP certainly shared your concerns about the amendments. We pushed procedurally to have them withdrawn. Now, on the principle of the bill around the handgun freeze, is that a position that either the Mohawk Council or the Iroquois caucus have taken around the principle of a freeze on handguns?
No.
Okay, so you have no position on that?
No.
Okay, that's very good to know. Thank you. I wanted to come back to the issue of transporting firearms from your community and the issue of the impacts on peacekeepers as well. Is it your impression that the way firearms legislation is implemented currently, that it makes it difficult for law enforcement, in this case the peacekeepers, to actually enforce the legislation?
Yes and no. It's difficult to explain that we have jurisdiction over our community and that we have exemptions within our community. It is difficult to, I don't know how to word this, to be honest. It's a yes and no answer, I mean. It's very, for the peacekeepers, they are community members as well. They are hunters as well. But to manage what happens as soon as somebody leaves our territory, it leaves Kahnawake, say to go to Jawarodu, say to go to another nation's territory or another hunting ground as a guest of that nation, it's out of the hands of the peacekeepers.
Yeah, okay.
So there are challenges, but within the community of Kahnawake, the peacekeepers are understaffed and they are underfunded in order to be able to execute what needs to be done.
Chief Lazare, the Minister of Public Safety recently had some meetings with your community, and it was reported in the local media on February 24th there was some quotes from a member of your community, Bobby Patton. Not sure if you're familiar with that gentleman or not, but you're nodding your head yes. I'm going to read these because I don't want to misquote him, because this is really interesting what he quoted here, and I'll ask your comments on them. This was what Mr. Patton said. "It's not like hunting back in the olden days where animals were plentiful, easy to get." He noted the hunting grounds have shrunk as development has intensified and populations have grown, increasing the need for efficiency in hunting. "If you want to go out and you want to kill one goose, one shot, one kill, perfect," he said, invoking those who are hunting for sport. However, he insists that goose hunters targeting the animals for sustenance depend on more aggressive weapons to yield enough meat. "They all depend on their semi-automatic weapons. One shot you're not going to get much from," he said. "It's going to limit the amount of harvest it's going to bring back to the community, to the people. It's going to lead to a lot of people probably starving," said Mr. Patton. Could you elaborate on that? That's quite a comment by Mr. Patton, that people will be starving.
So a lot of our community members are trying to go back to their original ways, or our original ways, and a lot of our community members do live off of the hunting game that they are successfully hunt. So there's moose meat, deer meat, there's geese that I know of that I've tried, and the rest that I haven't tried. There's beaver, there's so many different, so many different game that are used for sustenance. And a lot of families do rely on that. They prefer not to go to the local IGA. They prefer not to go to the local metro or local grocery stores. They prefer to hunt and harvest their own game and their own produce their own produce within their gardens and greenhouses.
Thank you for that. Obviously, it would be quite an impact if, I know it's been rescinded and taken back, but if these amendments went through, it's very tough to think that people could potentially be starving because of this incident. Not my quote, my members across, that was actually the Bobby Patton, the member of this community. So you can laugh and comment all you want, but you can call him if you want.
Start with you. Can you share with us what the impact of the 2020 OIC was on your community? The Order in Council, the 2020 Order in Council?
Sorry, there's so many acronyms in my job, I just forget what they are. So the impacts, I cannot reiterate this enough, that there is extreme systemic racism in policing. And when you don't train the officers federally or provincially with the rights of Indigenous peoples, those rights get overlooked on an individual basis in real life practice. When an individual from my community or any Indigenous community is stopped and trying to exercise their right, the officer at hand is not trained properly on how to deal with that matter, is not aware of that matter, and is not informed of that matter.
What I'm trying to understand, though, and I agree with you, I think it's really important that all our law enforcement are well aware of the challenges that your communities face. What I'm trying to understand, though, is given that there was the carve-out specifically for Indigenous communities in the OIC, in the Order in Council in 2020, I'm trying to understand what the specific impact, if any, was on your community. And if there wasn't one, then I guess the question I would ask is, would a similar carve-out be helpful to you in any future, or in C-21, for example?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so what I'm trying to understand is if, given that there was a specific carve-out in the Order in Council in 2020 that protected the rights of Indigenous communities to continue to hunt, would something like that in C-21 not address your concerns, given hopefully that there was no impact from 2020?
No.
So it wouldn't. So I'm trying to understand that if there was no impact in 2020, why would a similar provision now cause concern?
There is an impact. I don't know how to explain this. I'm sorry, I'm tripped up for words, but there is an impact in terms of the awareness. I know you're saying that the enforcements are aware. They're aware of our struggles. They're aware of the challenges. They are not properly educated. And they are not properly trained.
Okay, no,
that's the challenge. You can say all you want, you can put it in legislation that there's exceptions. When it comes into practice, that's where the challenge really lies.
So the issue is
Perfect.